There's something sacred about the places we claim as our own. Not through force, but through time, through memory, through the quiet rituals that shape our days. These spaces become extensions of ourselves, silent witnesses to our joys and sorrows, our transformations and our constancies. They hold our energy, our essence, our unspoken prayers. For Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, that place was a worn velvet chair positioned perfectly by the living room window of her modest two-story home on Maple Street. For 30 years, she had sat there every morning with her tea, watching the neighborhood wake up like a conductor observing her orchestra. She'd seen children grow into parents, trees stretch toward the sky with patient determination, and seasons paint the street in endless cycles of color. The pale greens of spring, the deep emerald of summer, the burnt oranges and crimsons of autumn, and the stark, honest whites of winter. The chair itself was unremarkable to anyone else who might glance at it. The velvet had faded from its original deep burgundy to a softer, more muted rose. The wooden arms bore the marks of decades, small scratches, the slight depression where her wedding ring had tapped countless times as she pondered life's mysteries. A water stain from that time her grandson, as a child, had spilled his juice during one of his visits. But to Margaret, every imperfection was a memory, every worn spot a testament to a life fully lived. The cushion had molded itself to her form over the years, creating a perfect cradle that no new furniture could ever replicate. It knew her body, her weight, the way she shifted when her hip ached, the way she leaned forward when something interesting caught her eye on the street below. The afternoon light would pour through that window like honey, thick and golden, warming her aging hands as she read her novels or simply sat in thought. She had read hundreds of books in that chair. Romances and mysteries, biographies and poetry, classics and contemporary fiction. She had knitted countless sweaters, scarves and blankets there, her needles clicking in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She had written letters to friends scattered across the country, her elegant cursive flowing across cream-colored stationery. She had simply sat, watching the world, thinking about her late husband Thomas, remembering their life together, processing her grief, and eventually finding peace. The window offered a perfect view of the street. She could see the Johnson family's house across the way, where 3 generations now lived under one roof. She watched old Mr. Peterson walk his ancient golden retriever every morning at 7:15, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of creatures who had earned their slow pace. She observed the mail carrier's route, the school bus stops, the comings and goings of neighbors who had become characters in the ongoing story of her daily life. In spring, she watched the cherry trees bloom in an explosion of pink. In summer, she saw children playing in sprinklers and families gathering for barbecues. In fall, she witnessed the great leaf migrations, nature's confetti celebrating the year's end. In winter, she watched snow transform the ordinary street into something magical, something clean and new. It wasn't just a chair. It was her anchor in a world that kept spinning faster than she could follow. It was her observatory, her lighthouse, her small kingdom in a world that had grown larger and lonelier since her husband passed 5 years ago. Thomas had died suddenly, a heart attack while gardening, doing what he loved, which was some small comfort. But his absence had carved a hole in her daily life that nothing could quite fill. The chair by the window had become her refuge, the place where she felt closest to him. where she could almost hear his voice commenting on the neighbors, making her laugh with his gentle observations about human nature. Her children, 2 daughters and a son, had their own lives now, scattered across different states, busy with careers and their own families. They called regularly, visited on holidays, worried about her living alone. But Margaret was fiercely independent, even at 78. She managed her house, paid her bills, cooked her meals, tended her small garden. She had her routines, her rhythms, her ways of marking time. And at the center of it all was that chair by the window, her throne, her sanctuary, her home within her home. But kingdoms, no matter how small, are always vulnerable to those who mistake silence for weakness and kindness for permission. Margaret had learned this lesson before, in smaller ways. The friend who borrowed money and never repaid it. The neighbor who asked for one favor that became a dozen. The salesman who saw her age and thought her an easy mark. But she had never imagined that the greatest threat to her small sovereignty would come from her own blood. From someone she had loved since the moment he was born. From her grandson Daniel. When her grandson Daniel moved in, Margaret welcomed him with open arms and an open home. He arrived on a rainy Tuesday in March, his car packed with boxes and bags, his face carrying the weight of disappointment and defeat. He was 32, which seemed impossibly young to Margaret, but felt impossibly old to him. He'd lost his job in the city, something to do with corporate restructuring, downsizing, the impersonal cruelty of modern business. His apartment lease was ending. His girlfriend had left him. He was, as he put it, going through a rough patch. He needed a place to get back on his feet, just for a few months, he promised. Just until he figured things out. Margaret understood struggle. She'd lived through wars and recessions, raised 3 children on modest means when Thomas's salary as a teacher barely stretched to cover their needs. She'd worked as a seamstress, taking in alterations and making custom dresses for weddings and proms, her fingers moving through fabric with practiced precision. She'd buried her parents, her husband, 2 siblings, and countless friends. She'd faced her own health scares, a cancer diagnosis 10 years ago that had thankfully responded to treatment. She knew what it meant to fall and have to climb back up. So she made space for Daniel without hesitation. She cleared out the guest room, the one that had been her sewing room for the past few years. She washed the linens, put fresh flowers on the dresser, made sure there were extra towels in the bathroom. She cooked his favorite meals, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, her famous apple pie, the chocolate chip cookies she'd made for him since he was a child. She asked about his job search, listened to his frustrations, offered encouragement. She was, as she had always been, a haven in the storm. But Daniel didn't just take space. He took her space. It started subtly, as these things often do. The first morning after he moved in, Margaret woke at her usual time, 6:30, a habit formed over decades of early rising. She made her tea, Earl Grey with a splash of milk and 1 sugar, in her favorite china cup, the one with the delicate rose pattern. She walked to the living room, anticipating the morning ritual that grounded her day, and found the room transformed. Daniel's laptop was set up on the side table next to her chair. Papers were scattered across the coffee table. His phone charger snaked across the floor, and there were clothes. A jacket draped over the back of the couch, shoes kicked off by the ottoman. She stood there for a moment, taking it in. then carefully moved his things aside and settled into her chair. She sipped her tea and opened her book. But something felt different. The space had been invaded, colonized. The peace she usually felt was disrupted by the presence of someone else's chaos. But she said nothing. He was her grandson. He was struggling. This was temporary. The next morning she woke to find Daniel already in her chair. He was on a video call, his laptop balanced on his knees. His voice animated as he spoke to someone about a job opportunity. The morning light, her light, illuminated his face as he smiled and nodded and gestured. Margaret stood in the doorway, cup trembling slightly in her hands, unsure what to do. She waited for him to finish his call, but it stretched on. 10 minutes, 15, 20. Finally, she retreated to the kitchen, sitting at the small breakfast table instead. Her view now of the refrigerator and the back door instead of the living street and the waking world. When Daniel finally emerged, grabbing coffee and a granola bar, she mentioned gently, "I usually sit there in the mornings, dear. It's part of my routine." He barely looked up from his phone. "Oh, sorry, Grandma. The lighting by that window is perfect for video calls. You know how important first impressions are for these interviews. You can sit anywhere, right? It's just a chair." Just a chair. The words stung more than they should have. But Margaret, who had spent a lifetime smoothing over conflicts and keeping the peace, who had been raised in an era when women were taught to accommodate and defer, simply nodded. "Of course, dear. Your job search is important." The next day he was there again. And the day after that. Her protests grew gentler, more apologetic, as if she were the one imposing. "I don't mean to be a bother, but I usually..." She would start, and he would interrupt with reasons why he needed the spot. The lighting, the Wi-Fi signal was strongest there. He had an important call. He was on a roll with his applications and couldn't break his focus. So she retreated, first to the couch, which didn't face the window and hurt her lower back. Then to the kitchen table, which was functional but joyless. Then to her bedroom, where she would sit on the edge of her bed, feeling like a guest in her own home. Her world grew smaller as his expanded, contracting around her like a shrinking sweater. The house that had been her domain for 3 decades began to feel like his, with her as the peripheral occupant, the elderly relative to be tolerated and worked around. Weeks passed. Daniel's temporary stay stretched from just a few months to something indefinite. His belongings spread throughout the house like kudzu. His dishes accumulated in the sink. His laundry piled up in the bathroom. He ate her food without replacing it, used her utilities without offering to contribute, treated her home like a free hotel with maid service. And still, she said nothing more than gentle reminders that went unheeded. The chair that had held her stories, her grief, her quiet joys, now held only his ambition and his entitlement. She would pass by the living room and see him there, sprawled in her spot, his feet propped up on her ottoman, his energy filling the space that had once been hers alone. Sometimes he would be on his laptop, sometimes on his phone, sometimes just scrolling through social media with a vacant expression. The window that had been her portal to the world became his backdrop for Zoom calls and selfies. Margaret began to feel like a ghost in her own home, fading a little more each day. She moved through the rooms quietly, trying not to disturb him, apologizing when she needed to pass by, making herself smaller and smaller. Her daughters called and asked how things were going with Daniel. "Fine," she would say, because what else could she say? That her grandson had taken over her house? That she felt displaced and diminished? It seemed petty, selfish even. He was family. He was struggling. She should be grateful she could help. But late at night, when Daniel was out with friends he'd reconnected with in town, Margaret would sometimes sit in her chair in the darkness. She wouldn't turn on the lights. She would just sit there, reclaiming her space in the shadows, feeling the familiar embrace of the cushions, looking out at the street lit by lamps and moonlight. In those stolen moments, she remembered who she was. Not just grandma, not just the old woman to be worked around, but Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had lived and loved and built a life worth honoring. It was during one of those late-night vigils that she made her decision. She was 78 years old, but she wasn't dead yet. She had been kind, patient, accommodating, all the virtues she'd been taught to value. But there was another virtue she'd forgotten: self-respect. There was another strength she'd neglected: the strength to say no, to reclaim what was hers, to refuse to be diminished. The next morning, while Daniel slept late, as he usually did, Margaret made a phone call, then another, and another. She spoke quietly, firmly, setting things in motion. She had been silent long enough. But silence is not surrender, and patience is not powerlessness. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 months after Daniel had claimed his grandmother's sacred spot, a moving truck pulled up outside the house on Maple Street. The leaves were turning, painting the neighborhood in shades of amber and rust. The air carried that particular clarity that comes with fall, when summer's humidity finally breaks and everything feels sharp and defined. Daniel looked up from his laptop, from her chair, confused. He'd been scrolling through job listings with the desultory energy of someone going through motions rather than making genuine effort. Through the window, he saw 2 large men in work uniforms stepping out of a truck emblazoned with swift-moving services. His first thought was that one of the neighbors was moving. His second thought, as the men walked directly toward his grandmother's house, was alarm. Margaret stood in the doorway, calm and composed, wearing her best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that she reserved for important occasions. Her white hair was styled, her lipstick applied with care. She looked like she was going to church, or to court, or to some ceremony that required dignity and presence. As the 2 movers approached, she greeted them with a smile and gestured them inside with the grace of a hostess welcoming expected guests. "Grandma, what's going on?" Daniel asked, his voice climbing with panic, as he watched the men enter the house with dollies and moving blankets. He stood up from the chair, finally vacating it. His laptop clutched to his chest like a shield. She smiled at him, the kind of smile that carries decades of wisdom and a touch of something sharper. Something that might have been there all along, but had been hidden beneath layers of kindness and accommodation. You're going on, dear. Back on your feet, just like you planned. What? What are you talking about? Daniel looked from his grandmother to the movers, who were now in the guest room, his room, beginning to pack his belongings with efficient, practiced movements. I've rented you a lovely apartment downtown, Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. It's a studio, very modern, perfect for a young man starting fresh. The first month's rent is paid. After that, you're on your own. You can't just kick me out. Daniel's voice rose, attracting the attention of Mr. Peterson across the street, who paused his morning walk to observe the commotion. I'm not kicking you out, dear. I'm helping you move forward. You said you needed a place to get back on your feet. Well, you've had 3 months. Your feet should be quite steady by now. There was no anger in her voice, no cruelty, just a firm finality that Daniel had never heard from her before. But I don't have a job yet. I'm still looking. Then I suggest you look harder. The apartment is in a building with several businesses. I'm sure they're hiring. There's a coffee shop, a bookstore, a grocery store. None of them are glamorous, but they're honest work. Your grandfather supported a family of 5 on a teacher's salary. I'm sure you can support yourself with whatever you find. Daniel tried different tactics. He bargained, just give me 1 more month. She shook her head. He pleaded, I'm family. How can you do this to family? She replied, family respects family. You've been a guest who forgot his manners. He tried guilt. What would Grandpa say? She answered, your grandfather would say that a man who takes advantage of his grandmother's kindness is no man at all. The movers continued their work, unfazed by the drama. They'd seen it all before. Families in conflict, the messy business of people and their spaces and their boundaries. They packed Daniel's clothes, his electronics, his boxes of belongings that had never been fully unpacked, because he'd always intended this to be temporary, even as he'd settled in as if it were permanent. Margaret walked past her grandson, past the movers, past the chaos of displacement, and she sat down in her chair. The velvet embraced her like an old friend. The afternoon light, it was nearly noon now, poured over her like a coronation, like a blessing, like a reclamation of something holy. She ran her hands over the worn arms of the chair, feeling every familiar scratch and mark. She looked out the window at her street, her view, her world. Grandma, please. Daniel tried one more time, his voice breaking now. The reality of the situation finally penetrating his defenses. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't realize. She turned to look at him, and her expression softened slightly. Daniel, I love you. I always will. But love doesn't mean letting someone diminish you. Love doesn't mean making yourself small so someone else can feel big. You took my space, my routine, my peace. You did it without asking, without appreciating, without even noticing. And I let you, because I thought that's what grandmothers do. We sacrifice. We accommodate. We disappear a little bit every day until there's nothing left. She paused, letting her words settle. But I'm not disappearing. Not anymore. Not for anyone. I've earned this chair. I've earned this window. I've earned the right to live in my own home without apology. And you need to learn that the world doesn't owe you comfort. You have to earn it. The movers finished loading the truck. One of them approached Margaret with a clipboard. All set, ma'am. We'll meet you at the new address. I'll meet you there in an hour, she confirmed, signing the paperwork with a steady hand. Daniel stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the empty space where his things had been, looking lost and young and suddenly aware of what he'd taken for granted. Can I at least visit? He asked quietly. When you've learned to respect boundaries, you're always welcome, Margaret said. But you'll call first, and you'll sit on the couch. As the truck drove away with Daniel following behind in his car, Margaret remained in her chair. She opened her book, a mystery she'd been trying to read for weeks but couldn't focus on because her sanctuary had been violated. Now the words flowed easily, the story unfolding as it should. She sipped her tea, which she'd made fresh once the house was quiet again. She looked out at the street, where life continued its ordinary, extraordinary dance. Mrs. Johnson across the way waved from her porch, and Margaret waved back. Mr. Peterson and his golden retriever made their afternoon round, both of them nodding in her direction. The mail carrier delivered letters and magazines, sliding them into the box with practiced ease. Children came home from school, their voices carrying on the autumn air. The world turned, as it always did. But now, Margaret was back in her proper place within it. That evening, her daughter Sarah called. Mom, Daniel just called me very upset. He says you kicked him out? I helped him move into his own apartment, Margaret corrected. There's a difference. He says you were cruel. I was clear. That's not the same as cruel. There was a pause on the line. Then Sarah laughed, a sound of surprise, and something like admiration. Good for you, Mom. Honestly, we were worried he was taking advantage, but we didn't want to interfere. I didn't need you to interfere. I needed to remember that I could handle my own life. Are you okay? Really? Margaret looked around her living room, now restored to order. Her books were back on the coffee table. Her knitting basket was beside the chair. The space breathed with her energy again, settled and peaceful. I'm better than okay, sweetheart. I'm home. In the days that followed, Margaret fell back into her routines with a joy she hadn't felt in months. She woke at 6:30 and made her tea. She sat in her chair and watched the morning unfold. She read her books, worked on her knitting, wrote her letters. She had lunch with friends from her book club and told them the story, which made them laugh and applaud. Several of them shared their own stories of being taken for granted, of making themselves small, of finally reclaiming their space. Daniel, for his part, struggled at first. The studio apartment was smaller than he'd expected. He had to find work, taking a job at the bookstore in his building. which paid far less than his previous career, but covered his bills. He had to cook his own meals, do his own laundry, manage his own life without his grandmother's invisible labor supporting him. It was hard. It was humbling. It was necessary. 3 months later, on Christmas Eve, he called and asked if he could visit. Margaret said yes. When he arrived, he brought flowers, white roses, her favorite. He sat on the couch as instructed. He apologized, really apologized, not with excuses, but with genuine understanding of what he'd done. "I didn't see you, Grandma," he said. "I was so caught up in my own problems that I didn't see you as a person with your own needs and your own life. I just saw you as Grandma, like you existed to take care of me. I'm sorry." Margaret, sitting in her chair by the window with the Christmas lights twinkling outside, nodded. "I accept your apology, and I'm proud of you for learning this lesson. Some people never do." They had dinner together, the pot roast and apple pie that were traditions. They talked, really talked, about his job and his life and his plans. He asked about her, genuinely interested in her book club and her knitting projects and her daily routines. When he left, he hugged her tight and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me become someone who uses people." "Thank you for becoming someone worth knowing," she replied. After he left, Margaret returned to her chair. The house was quiet again, but it was a good quiet, a chosen quiet. She looked out at the winter street, where snow was beginning to fall, transforming the world into something clean and new. The lesson settled into the room like dust catching sunlight, like truth finding its proper place. You can borrow someone's grace, occupy their space, mistake their gentleness for surrender, but take someone's place long enough, and you forget it was never truly yours. And when they finally reclaim what's theirs, you'll realize you were never sitting in just a chair. You were sitting on borrowed time, borrowed space, borrowed patience. You were living on the accumulated goodwill of someone who loved you enough to let you stay, and who loved herself enough to finally say no. Margaret had learned something too. She'd learned that kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. It's self-erasure. She'd learned that making space for others doesn't mean vacating your own life. She'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be diminished. Because when you make yourself small, you teach others that you don't matter. And everyone matters. Even, especially, the elderly woman in the chair by the window, who had lived and loved and earned her place in the sun. The chair remained by the window for the rest of Margaret's days. She lived another 12 years, healthy and independent, surrounded by friends and family who had learned to respect her boundaries. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at 90, her children and grandchildren gathered at the house to settle her affairs. They stood in the living room, looking at the chair by the window, and they all understood that it wasn't just furniture. It was a symbol of a life lived with dignity, of a woman who had been kind but not weak, accommodating but not invisible, loving but not self-sacrificing to the point of disappearance. Daniel, now 44 and successful in a career he'd built through his own hard work, asked if he could have the chair. His sisters agreed. He took it to his own home, where he placed it by a window in his living room. He sat in it sometimes, feeling the worn velvet, seeing the marks of his grandmother's life, remembering the lessons she'd taught him. And when his own children grew old enough to understand, he told them the story of the chair by the window and the woman who had loved him enough to teach him that respect begins with respecting yourself. The story spread through the family, becoming legend, becoming wisdom passed down through generations. It became a touchstone for moments when someone felt taken for granted, when boundaries needed to be set, when love required clarity rather than accommodation. "Remember the chair by the window," they would say to each other, and everyone would know what it meant. Because some stories are more than stories. Some chairs are more than chairs. Some moments of reclamation are so powerful, so they ripple forward through time, teaching lessons long after the original teacher is gone. Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, in one decisive act of self-respect, had given her family a gift that would last forever. The understanding that taking care of others must never come at the cost of erasing yourself, that kindness must be balanced with boundaries, that love is most powerful when it includes love for oneself. And somewhere, in whatever place the spirits of the departed reside, Margaret sat in her celestial chair by a celestial window, looking out at the vast universe with the same quiet satisfaction she'd felt in her living room on Maple Street. She had lived well. She had loved well. She had taught well. And in the end, she had reclaimed not just her chair, but her dignity, her space, herself. That was her legacy. That was her triumph. That was the story that would never end, told and retold, teaching and teaching again, as long as there were people who needed to hear it. The chair by the window, the woman who wouldn't disappear, the grandson who learned, the lesson that echoed through time. Take someone's place long enough, and you forget it was never yours. But remember it in time, and you might become someone worthy of being invited back. Not to take, but to share, not to occupy, but to visit, not to diminish, but to honor. And that makes all the difference.